Hey folks, in this video I'm going to tell you all about a private airfield in Hamsey Green, just outside Croydon. Before I do that, let's go over a bit of context. We have Hamsey Green Pond, much smaller than it used to be. This is the Limpsfield Road, the B269, and if we carry on past the shops, that takes us to Sanderstead. Behind the hoardings is where the Good Companions once was. That is Tythe Pitshaw Lane. Right in the middle of the picture is Martin Close, and that's where Hamsey Green Farm was. If you follow Tythe Pitshaw Lane, it will take you down towards Whiteleaf. And these are the newer shops, probably built in about the 50s, I'm guessing. Behind there was some of the farm buildings, and that direction takes you towards Wallingham. But the video today starts in Kingswood Lane. This section of Kingswood Lane is made up. I remember when it wasn't, but it's made up all the way down to really where the airfield was, the main airfield buildings. And that is where I'm going to tell the story, and in particular my connection with the story. It goes back to my dear old nan. When I was a young child, I'd come over here with my brother and probably sister and maybe a bit of a family outing. And I remember Nan saying there used to be an airfield over here because we would cut through from one field to get to the main recreation ground. And I remember looking up and seeing this rather odd shaped building, sort of corrugated iron structure. But I noticed also that it was part of a stables. It was Barnfield's stables. And I'll be honest, I didn't do anything with that information for about 50 years. And then in the last few years, when I was researching local history, I thought, what's the story there? And quite a story unfolded. Just looking over here now, there's a hedge boundary all the way along the lane here. And now there's a metal fencing and a gap and then another hedge boundary onto the sports field. It was quite different to how it was back in the day, because we literally lift up two wires and climb through the middle to cut across this sports field to get to the recreation ground. But yeah, funny how things change and security gets brought in and that kind of thing. One of the first things I found out was that in 1933, Gertrude Vere Gardner of Overhill, Wallingham, bought land on Kingswood Lane, Wallingham from Hamsey Green Farm. So that gave me a marker, and then I could frame my research around that period. And this, currently the entrance road to Kingsmead Equestrian Centre, formerly Barnfields when I was a young child. And this would lead you up to the hangar. Got an old photo here from the Bourne Society taken in the 1970s. And sadly, in that decade, there was a fire and the hangar burnt to the ground. So there has been an equestrian centre here for some considerable time. So I'm going to skirt to the left and go around the boundary of the former airfield. And that's the area that's enclosed for the horses. I don't know if it's still there, but in the middle there, there were some steel runners in the ground. I filmed them a few years back that were for the sliding doors of the hangar. This is a footpath that takes you to either Farley Common, or as we're going to do, we're going to go round the recreation ground and find some other sites. One of the things that I was keen to understand was the types of different aircraft that were associated with Hamsey Green. And I say associated because I believe Hamsey Green Airfield was used as the location in terms of registration, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all the planes were here or here for any reasonable period of time. Some were bought and sold within weeks, but there was quite a list of aircraft here. This table shows the owners and operators. So what became of all those aircraft? Well, some were sold. Two ended up being used in the Spanish Civil War, one on each side. Some were scrapped. Some actually still survive, which is really quite impressive if you think about it. Now I'm just going to pause here. I'm pointing at where we would have been looking at the hangar back in the day, and it was no doubt a hive of activity. Charles learnt to fly at Croydon Airport. He got his licence in 1931 and very quickly became a highly successful air racer. In fact, in 1936 and 37 he won the King's Cup. They were two very grand victories, but there were many. And if we look at his story in even more detail, he was quite a successful sailor. He joined the Essex Yacht Club with his father, and I think that gave him a taste for all things racing. This is Hamsey Green playing field, and originally, when it was an active airfield, this fence wasn't here. So the whole plot was this general square shape, and then over to the field next to it, including the hangar in the corner. So if you're thinking 1930s and aviation, then obviously World War II was a factor. Now Charles wore glasses, and that precluded him from joining the RAF as a pilot. But he did work at the Air Ministry down in Bristol, and in his career he was involved in some very impressive projects, one being London Heathrow Airport. So very active, very skilled. There are videos on YouTube that show Charles's King's Cup wins. They're on the sort of Pathé News style clips. So I'll put links in the description below, and you actually hear Charles saying a few words after he'd accepted the trophy. Marvellous to see. Now Charles had a brother Jimmy. His actual name was Richard Exton Gardner, which was the exact same name as his father, so they called him Jimmy. Jimmy worked for Yardley, and in 1939 he joined the Fleet Air Arm, and he was a high achiever there, very successful, got promoted very quickly and saw a lot of combat. In July 1940 he joined 242 Squadron under Douglas Bader. That would have no doubt given him some great experiences. Pilots who were part of the Fleet Air Arm and gave support to the RAF would often have some kind of nickname or memento for the fact that they were part of a naval operation. And in Jimmy's case, he had the Nelson England Expects flag display on the fuselage of his Hawker Hurricane. He was awarded the DSC in 1941 and the OBE in 1945. And for his achievements as a pilot, he was an ace. So really, really special guy, with a link to this little old airfield here at Hamsey Green. The Gardner brothers joined forces in the 60s and took up powerboat racing. Again, they were very successful, achieved some victories in the Torquay Cows race and other races around the world. Almost anything involving a lot of racing and a lot of power and a lot of skill, they were very good at. There were some other happenings at the airfield in the 1930s. So in 1937, Richard Taylor, who'd been building an aircraft there, it was his own design, and he'd had some warnings that there may be safety issues with the design, but he didn't really heed these warnings. He also wasn't a qualified pilot, but he was very determined. Not only had he registered the Taylor Experimental version 1, but he'd also registered another 3 versions. He'd achieved a few minutes flying to test it out, but on the first proper maiden test flight, he took off successfully, went to turn, caught the wind, and collapsed to the ground, and he died. There was a full inquiry that took place, and they basically found that the issues that caused the crash and his death were in line with the warnings that had been given in the first place. Tragic. In 1938, a couple of young RAF cadets broke in and stole one of the very important aircraft, because it was the one that Charles Gardner had won the 1936 King's Cup, the Vega Gull. They stole it, they crashed it, and they were taken down to Kendy Police Station, and there were some injuries involved, one thing and another. I looked up what happened to the guys, and one of them, he survived until passing away in the 80s. But the younger of the two, Sergeant Hauser, he joined the RAF, died in 1942. Just going to head through from Verdane Gardens, where the recreation ground is, to Cruise Avenue, because Charles Gardner used to live at number 10 Cruise Avenue. So just have a quick look at the house. Middle of the picture there is number 10 Cruise Avenue, Charles Gardner's home in the mid-1930s. If you look at an aerial photograph, it really looks like there's a footpath from Charles's home all the way across to the aircraft hangar. So I think he trod that path. I'm going to call it Charles Gardner's path. It doesn't exist now because now we've got more houses in Cruise Avenue and in the whole area generally. But it's just something that when I saw, I thought, well, has to be, doesn't it? He would commute using that Compass Swift that I mentioned earlier. He would commute to work. I believe he went to an aerodrome in Kent, but he was quite involved in the design of the engines and that kind of thing. Very, very clever, very technical guy. Understood the aircraft, and that probably led to his success in racing terms. So we've looped around a bit. This is the Limpsfield Road, so we've got Wallingham straight up there. Woodhouse Way development, this is fairly new, the last couple of years. And this goes back towards Hamsey Green. There wasn't a need to use the airfield during World War II from a Royal Air Force perspective. I believe there are a couple of accounts of planes being forced to land there, but it wasn't an RAF station or an official landing ground even. But there was a gliding school there. It was the home of 143 and 162 ATC gliding school. And there they would have daglings, Kirby cadets, Kirby kites, mainly ground hops, that kind of thing. They would never fly beyond the perimeter of the airfield. And as we've sort of picked out and we can see again, it wasn't a huge area. Now, I was fortunate enough to meet up with Graham Brooks from the Bourne Society. Graham's in his 90s now, but in his younger days, he would fly gliders at Hamsey Green Airfield. And he mentioned to me about some of the restrictions and that kind of thing. It was a fairly low-key affair, but you would still learn the basic skills. The actual gliding school itself is still around in name, but it's sort of linked with what goes on at Kenley now, RAF Kenley. In 1946, the Croydon Times posted an item about Hamsey Green Airfield being put up for auction. In 1947, these aerial photos were taken. I referred to them earlier, but they were worth another look. You can see the sort of double height roof and the concrete semicircle areas where they would bring the aircraft out. And this not quite as good image of life in Hamsey Green that was taken back in the day. Still nice to have a look and pick out the details as best you can. Trenham Drive. Now I'm going to go to the end here. This is the entrance today to the field, although I fear it may have a gate across because no one's hiring their facilities today. So we've got playing fields all the way over here. And then in that far corner is where the hangar was. I remember it as old Josephians, and we would literally cut through Kingswood, through the fence. As I say, it was a very loose kind of fence. There were Leylandii trees and wires. They weren't electric wires. You could easily lift them up, and as a kid you can easily get through. So we wouldn't try and play football there or anything. We would just use that to walk through and get to the main playing field, the squarer one. So it was old Josephians and then Post Office Sports and Social Club, and they let it out for football and other kind of sporting activities and play groups and all that kind of thing. So it's a well-used resource. You will recall at the beginning that I mentioned about my nan. And the one thing that I'd never really looked into is, how did Nan know there was an airfield here? She lived in Selhurst. She certainly wasn't a pilot. Well, I think I worked it out. So my nan's brother, Albert Fuller, Married Laura Fuller. Her dad used to run the rifle range at Woldingham many moons ago. And their house that they moved into was number 3 Trenham Drive. So Nan would have visited, and I'm sure would have been perfectly aware that there was an airfield at the end of the road. They were probably quite noisy, and even if she didn't see them, Bert and Laura would have done. Opposite is number 3 Trenham Drive, so that is where Uncle Bert and Auntie Laura lived. Where my nan would have visited, it would have been quite a modern new house then. And that's where she got to know the story of Hamsey Green Airfield. So we've got this little quiet area. It's between Warlingham and Sanderstead, called Hamsey Green. The Gardners had their main home at Overhill in Warlingham. They had the means and the interest to acquire the land. The private airfield was built. The sons developed their skills and interests, one becoming a very active and heroic pilot during the Battle of Britain, and the other achieving great success in aviation racing in the 1930s. There were some other things that happened here. In 1933, Alan Cobham ran one of his air pageants in Hamsey Green. So the airfield would have existed then, but Cobham had all what he needed in a field. They really didn't need much land to be able to put on these air shows. Very successful. So there was quite a bit of aviation history linked to Hamsey Green and the airfield. It wasn't just the brothers' successes. All in all, a great story. And as I say, I'm claiming a bit of a connection to it because of my nan and her brother who lived just down the road here at number 3. I hope you've enjoyed that video. If you have, please hit like. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please hit subscribe. And if you'd like to support me through a very small monthly payment, just hit join. Look after yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.